Okay, I think we'll begin. So, welcome to Policy and Practice at the School of Public Policy and the Department of Political Science here at UCL. Looking around, most of you should know that, as you're many of my students on the MSc in Public Policy, so thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Cohen. I'm Professor of Public Policy. I've actually studied lobbying for 30 years, but in another venue, looking at Brussels, and I'm also the Pro-Vice-Provost for Global Engagement. So sometimes I'm obviously dealing on policy issues around international student mobility and so forth. So I will be fascinated with the talk today. The talk is on lobbying, participatory democracy or crony capitalism. Incredibly topical. It really can't, and I know many of you have asked for this talk over the last few years, so I'd like to thank our organisers for pulling this together. Lobbying is big business. In the area I know, in Brussels alone, there's some 40,000 lobbyists. We were just discussing before, we think there's 9 to 10, maybe 12,000 lobbyists in London, and I couldn't even begin to count the number of lobbyists that work in Brussels and with various revolving doors that are currently occurring in Washington as we speak. But lobbying has a sort of mixed reputation. It's incredibly important to the machinery of government. It's incredibly important to actually making good policy. It legitimizes policy through wide consultation. It can legitimize policy through quality of information. Government officials and individuals here have been in government know that functionaries, bureaucrats, politicians, they don't have perfect information. They need lobbyists, they need consultancies to bring information to the table to hopefully make better policy. So from a normative perspective, lobbying doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It can be a very good force for good if we've got good lobbyists like we have in the room here. However, it can also be bad. It can, we can have capture of a particular policy domain by particular individuals because they're the only ones that have perhaps the full information or knowledge on a particular policy area. It can slow down the policy process, churning it up, the white noise of various voices shouting in different directions. And at its worst, it can potentially even be corrupt. It can be, it's not legitimate. Most lobbying in Britain, I would like to say, most lobbying in Brussels, would like to believe, is legitimate, and it is potentially a useful input into the policy machine. But there are questions I think we all need to think about the level of transparency, the level of accountability that lobbyists need to face if we are to have good government and good lobbying. I just Googled before the start of this lecture, and I found the Chartered Institute of Public Affairs did a survey last year of its membership, and 9 out of 10 lobbyists believed that there needed to be greater transparency and more regulation of lobbying in the UK. In Brussels, an area I know, it's become a mandatory transparency register, and it's been an incremental process to that, but it's actually facilitating and helping the making of policy making. So those are a few questions we can think about. We're incredibly lucky today. We got, I was going to say 4, we actually currently got 3, but we got 4 what I would call good lobbyists. They are individuals that have been constructed for the policy process. And they will discuss a little bit about their perception of lobbying, how to lobby, the strategy of lobbying, and potentially maybe how we might regulate lobbying as we move forward. Our speakers come with many years of experience, on both sides of the fence. They've been in government, they've been lobbyists, they've been consultants. Our first lobbyist, Charles Lewington, has been the chairman of Hanover Communications, but he was also a very high-profile individual as a political advisor to the Conservative government, and he's been a political journalist, and he's also, I think, currently the chair of the actual the British Public Affairs Consultancy Association. So you've got many years' experience, you've been on both sides of the fence, and you're now part of the wider association of the sector. So I look forward very much to hearing what you have to say. We have Yasmin Diamond, also somebody who's been on both sides of the fence. For many years, she worked at the Home Office, and before that, DEFRA, as a director of communication, so she's seen the need for input into the legislative process. And she's currently the Vice President for Global and Corporate Affairs at IHG, the hotel group, where she's responsible for the external and international relations and corporate governance and global governance of the company. So that's a multinational that's operating in many jurisdictions, not just the UK. So that also would be fascinating, or will be fascinating. We would have Daniel Hamilton. I hope he'll arrive a little bit later. He's the Vice President of Global Corporate Affairs and the Director of the FTI consultancy. If he arrives, I'll say a few more words about him. And then we've also got Tamsin Cade, who is the Head of Strategic Communications at Uplift UK. And prior to that, she worked for Spinwatch, I believe, which is a very interesting organisation. It's an organisation that tries to hold lobbyists to account. And so I'm sure that you'll have many interesting things to say about the regulation, potentially, and transparency and accountability of lobbying. So we really have got 3, potentially 4 leading experts in the field of lobbying, and I'm going to learn a lot just sitting here. So thank you very much. So perhaps, Charles, do you want to lead out?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much for the invitation. You've made the case for lobbying rather well, actually. I'm not sure we need to add very much. And it's great to be at UCL. We have, as a consultancy, we've employed a lot of UCL graduates very successfully, smart people, gone on to do great things. One of my favourite pastimes is talking to young people as they're deciding if they want careers in public policy or in the media or in journalism, about the opportunities but also the pitfalls as well. So showing my age here in a youthful room, I've worked in and around Westminster for 37 years as a political journalist, press guy number 10, and the founder of Hanover Communications in 1998. We now are based in UK, Brussels, Dublin, and 3 countries in the Middle East. And we provide corporate and public affairs consultancy services, mostly to healthcare. It's about 40% of our business, financial services, property, investment funds, and technology, particularly big American technology we'll talk about. So I've lived through cash for questions, cash for mortgages, cash for passports we had, cash for advertising concessions, duck houses, wallpaper, and most recently reading glasses and Taylor Swift tickets. So in a way, it's no wonder that the public has a pretty poor view of politicians. There have been a number of lobbying scandals, I have to say, mostly involving members of parliament or former ministers or former prime ministers. There have been dramas involving lobbying companies themselves, but they've been decreasing since a light touch regulation was introduced by the coalition government back in 2014, but also self-regulation by industry bodies. So it is a much cleaner and more professional industry than it ever has been. Though I can see a few amber lights flashing now, we might talk about that. I am now actually as honorary president of the Public Relations and Communications Association, which is the main industry's trade body that insists that all members publish the names of the companies they lobby for and the names of the consultants who are acting as public affairs lobbyists. So we publish all the clients that Tamsin can write about. In 1999, when I set up, the UK government, including the NHS, was about a quarter of the size it is now, defined by head count and in real cash terms. The public sector accounted for 35% of GDP. It now represents 44% of GDP, and it hit 52% of GDP during the pandemic. The public affairs industry, both in-house and consultancy, has grown accordingly. And the UK has produced 5 out of the top 10 global financial, corporate and public affairs agencies, as befits an economy that is a global leader in business services. In fact, the pandemic year is, I think, quite a good case study of what the lobbying industry does very well, but also how rogue actors give us a bad name. So from the middle of February 2020 onwards, many in our business, and I assume particularly at IHG, were desperately trying to speak to anyone in government who knew what was going on. I was particularly involved in helping, through 2 or 3 clients, the consortium of manufacturers, with a great ventilator challenge, which delivered 13,000 ventilators to the NHS with 4 months, and an urgent campaign to keep fast food takeaway sector alive when all restaurants and pubs were closed down. Colleagues elsewhere in my industry were involved in helping AstraZeneca raise £65 million from the government in order to start research on the COVID vaccine, which was approved for use within 6 months. It was absolutely extraordinary. And other lobbyists were involved in, working for businesses like Oxford Nanopore that produced 50,000 pieces of testing equipment for NHS labs. Then along came a front company backed by a Tory peer, selling £200 million worth of surgical gowns and face masks, using a fast-track route into the Department of Health. So for all the good work that we do, there is always someone who tries to skim the system and the taxpayer. It's hard to recall the speed that all this happened at, because in February 26, the Department of Health said the virus was not circulating and there was no change or risk to the public. 4 weeks later, we'd been locked down, and 2 weeks later, the NHS was reporting 1,000 deaths a day. And inside government, particularly the Department of Health, there was chaos. There was a complete meltdown in that department. We had clients with businesses screaming. They couldn't get people to answer the phone. No one was responding to emails. It was the same in the Cabinet Office as well. It was very difficult to get any sense out of the civil service. There was global competition for PPE, yet every supplier had to wait ages for quality approvals. Government scientists took a week to determine whether a pizza box could transmit COVID or not. And also all the usual compliance processes completely broke down. Normally those compliance processes would have red flagged a bid that had come in from a Tory peer who donated money to the party. But in ethics and compliance in wartime, I want to discuss this, they're one of the first things to go. Worth pointing out that ethics and compliance in government doesn't work very well in peacetime either, and ask this current government about that. So I'm not alone in concluding that government, as it's grown, has become less efficient and lacks expertise, particularly when it comes to understanding business. As Rachel Reeves is coming to understand, regulators have grown at the same pace, but with equally patchy outcomes. And in my 25 years as a consultant, businesses themselves have become bigger and more complicated and harder to explain to government officials that don't necessarily understand what they do. And it's a conversation where professional intermediaries are absolutely essential. So to address the question on the order paper, the dialogue between business leaders and government is a vital part of a participatory democracy, since companies provide jobs, innovation, and tax revenues to fund public services. So helping them understand the political and policy priorities of government and navigate an administration riddled with bureaucracy has never been more important. Occasionally, the crony capitalists slip through the net, but they are an exception and deserve to be caught and pilloried, but they are not the rule. And that's my case for the defence.
Okay, thank you very much. Fantastic. Okay. Yasmin.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Diamond. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I was very excited about this. I even wrote my own notes down. I didn't get someone else to write them for me. As David said, I'm responsibility for all global corporate affairs and sustainability at Intercontinental Hotels Group. And previous to that, we're in 100 countries, so UK is one of our centres. We're listed here. We are in 100 countries with over 350,000 colleagues across the 100 countries working in hotels in our corporate offices. Before that, I did 10 years in Whitehall. I was saying to Tamsin earlier, probably one of the 10 best years of my career. Not that I don't love IHG, I do, but they were brilliant times. And in those 10 years, it was Department for Education, Employment, Home Office, and DEFRA, so very, very different. And before that, I worked at the BBC and in the NHS, so I've seen a number of different sides. And my kind of professional spine has always been corporate affairs. So just for me, I think, I don't call it lobbying, I call it public affairs. And public affairs, I think, is such an important part of our democratic process. And it's important for governments to actually have a wide-ranging view. And as I've got experience of both sides, it's just good democracy. When I worked in Whitehall, I would not know every single minutiae of every single policy if we just sat in our own offices and didn't reach out to various different organisations or businesses to give that perspective. And many organisations do public affairs. Universities do, the NHS, charity sector, the third sector. So it's not just big public businesses. And when I worked in Whitehall, we had a really clear process of involving businesses and other organisations. And your policies were a lot weaker if you didn't take in a broad range of views and you didn't take in what other people heard, or whether it be different political views or different stances. And just because somebody was kind of lobbying you did not mean that their opinion swayed you, because remember, you had a broad spectrum, and that's the important thing. If you only go to one particular thought process or one particular group, then you end up you can have jaundiced policies there, and that's why you have to have broader, and I knew that when I worked in Whitehall. Governments recognise the importance of reaching out to business and getting a business perspective. They even, number 10 Downing Street, I think the Cabinet Office, I think even the Treasury, they have special units that are called business engagement units. Very open, it's very transparent, and we work with them. They also have a number of advisory councils that may be jointly chaired by a minister and a business leader. Again, they're all transparent. I think the minutes are available. There's nothing kind of secretive about them. And the one from my sector in hospitality and hotels, they're saying a visitor economy advisory group, which is chaired by the tourism minister, and also our MD for our company for Europe. So she co-chairs it, so you can get all of the views around the table. I do accept that public affairs sometimes, and particularly the word lobbying, is very derogatory, and it can be seen as it's working in the shadows. And so I know there's that mystery around it. And so I think things like these are really important, so we can actually discuss what it is and, really importantly, what it isn't. And if some of those practices are happening, how do you kind of stamp them out, which is around the transparency around registers, etc. For my organisation, I work with governments in two main areas. Number one is to kind of educate them about our industry, the hospitality, the hotel sector and tourism. What we contribute to UK PLC, what we contribute to GDP, but also many of you will probably have jobs in bars and pubs and hotels, what we contribute to job creation. We're a massive job creation industry in this country and across the world. And the second thing we also do is we advocate to government. So when government are proposing to either amend laws, change laws, bring in new regulations, we do work with them to give our point of view, to represent our industry point of view. I want to be really clear, within IHG, we are completely apolitical. We do not donate to political campaigns. We do not support one political candidate over another. We definitely don't give them free hotel rooms and hospitality. And we don't lobby saying, please build one of our IHG hotels here over and above one of our competitors. And what we do is we lobby for the sector. And we advocate for the sector. And we do advocate for tourism-friendly policies. We advocate for the UK to be a place where you can get inward investment of capital so people can invest into various businesses. And we really lobby for making the UK a place where it's attractive to do business. Because as we know, so many other countries are trying to attract the same capital into their businesses and into their countries. One of the examples, I was also going to use a COVID example. I talked about when you sit in Whitehall, you will not know the machinations of what happens in industry. But if you remember during COVID, and I remember it very vividly, and I hated it, was we had to basically shut down hotels, we had to shut down restaurants and bars, etc. And we had to work with governments about what are the implications of that. We then had to also work with government about reopening. What's the safety of reopening? How do you, if you want everybody to show a COVID vaccine before they come in, how do you, what are the digital things that a venue's going to have? And also, how do we help the majority of our hotels are small businesses? How do you help them to keep viable through a place where literally there was a shutdown? And with the best will in the world, the most cleverest civil servant will know the machinations. I don't know all the machinations about opening and closing down big venues or pubs or restaurants. So to me, public affairs is not just lobbying. To me, it's making sense of the external environment. In a global company in 100 countries, we have to scan what the regulations are, how it impacts our hotels, how we give advice to our colleagues and our owners. We also, for me, public affairs is also strategic communications, because clearly we have to communicate with government, but a really big, important part for us, on behalf of our hotels and on behalf of our owners, is translating often quite complicated government policy into what that means into the running of your business. And yeah, we do policy work as well. We do definitely talk to governments about policy. We work with, all the parties during the election campaign when they were preparing their manifestos and when they're out on their listening roadshows. As Charles has said, there are some real checks and balances in place, and I'm a big believer in that transparency and checks and balances. And even in the ministerial code, there's a whole section in the ministerial code around meeting with external organisations, where ministers are actually, there's a section on it that says, meet as many people as you possibly can, so that you've got a broad range of views for when you're trying to formulate policy. The US has their regulations, the EU has those. And within IHG, we have our own code of conduct. We're a very well-governed organisation. And in that code of conduct, there is a whole part of it which is on political activities. And you've got to do yearly updates and refreshes on it. So overall, I would say, of course, you will not always win the argument, and that's okay. But the important thing is to have those conversations, share the views, and make your voice heard.
Okay, thank you very much. Another positive view of lobbying. Okay.
What is not positive about lobbying?
Yeah, why?
I think you're just about to find out.
And you stole my line, perfect. I was about to say that Tamsin now will give us another perspective on this. I mean, one of the things that we can say about the UK is it has an incredibly light touch, perhaps too light touch regulatory code of conduct compared to the rest of Europe or the US. And I know that you have lobbied for many years for more regulations.
I have in my past life. Hello, everybody. So I'm Tamsin Cave. I'm head of strategic communications at a small climate group called Uplift. I'm going to have to do this because I can look at you and then look at that because I can't see otherwise. We are a small climate group which basically campaigns for the rapid and fair or just phase out of North Sea oil and gas. You'll be aware that we're in a climate crisis and we should be opening new oil and gas fields. So that's basically what we do. We just put a sort of flesh on the bones of that. We have certain field fights, so we are fighting particular fields, and there was one called the Cambo oil field that we managed to successfully, we fought and then Shell pulled out of, so that's still sitting there undeveloped. This is a huge field off the coast of Shetland, and currently we are fighting another one. It's Cambo's nearest neighbour, which is a massive, bigger neighbouring oil field called the Rosebank oil field. And I don't know if you see today, we actually won in court, in the Scottish courts this morning. So I have had a mental day on the phone. Not as mental as my boss who's been out broadcast all day. But yeah, no, that was some really good news that we had this morning, and I was so looking forward to Daniel being here because we beat one of his clients.
That's why he's not coming.
That's why he didn't
I'm
come.
wondering whether they're doing a little bit of kind of damage limitation.
Back in the office.
Anyway. Yeah, although that was going to make me slightly reticent about how much I talk about the work that we do, because unless he's going to put Ithaca's common strategy on the table, I'm probably not going to do ours. Anyway, so yeah, we within Uplift we have a number of teams. We have obviously a legal team, a legal strategies. We have a campaigns team. public affairs, comms, and I do, the strat comms and press side of things. So that's us, but probably more interestingly and relevant to this debate is the job that I had prior to this, which is working for an organisation called Spinwatch, which I'm not sure it exists, certainly not in its old form at the moment. But we basically, I spent 10 or 15 years investigating majority corporate lobbying and public relations and how it distorts our democracy. And I wrote a book called A Quiet Word, and the subtitle was Lobbying, Crony, Capitalism and Broken Politics in Britain, I think. And I also, during that time, spent a lot of time. I was a lobbyist, and I used to go to a lot of events like this, and have to say it was like Alcoholics Anonymous. I am a lobbyist, and I was lobbying essentially against the lobbying industry. So that's like Charles. So we go way back, and I remember last time I met you was sat in I think it was a BBC radio studio. And we had a right ding-dong, and it was really fun. And what I was lobbying for, what we were lobbying for, was exactly that, some transparency regulations for lobbyists. In the end, we got something called the Lobbying Act, which is, the names it got called in Parliament whilst it went through were, amusing. A dog's breakfast, a sham, a joke. It was designed to, it was under the David Cameron's coalition government, and it was designed to make us go away. They could tick a box and say, yes, we've regulated lobbying, but it did nothing. It does nothing. We now have a statutory register of consultant lobbyists, and I'm sorry, Charles, it means that you have to pay money and go on a register that provides zero transparency of what you do. It's a pretend fake register. We are, the industry in the UK is not particularly, it's just not open as it is in other jurisdictions. So about lobbying, in theory it's good. It's what you do if you write to your MP, or if you sign a petition or whatever. You are trying to influence the decisions of government, and that is a good thing. And we should all be doing that, and possibly more. But in practice, what it looks like on the ground, and not far from here, is it's offices of large consultancies like Charles, but also in-house teams within every single giant, large and small corporation will have a lobbying, public affairs, whatever you want to call it, team, and it does involve a lot of stratcoms as well, and PR. There are armies of corporate lobbyists basically who dominate this, what is a multi-billion pound industry. And they end up corrupting and dominating what happens in our politics. And that's because they are able to outgun lots of other voices that are also doing it. It's not that NGOs and unions don't lobby, they obviously do. And the way that I used to kind of sort of use a metaphor for how I describe this is that if you look at, I don't know, Shell's offices, right opposite Parliament, or BP just around the corner, or I don't know, big pharmaceutical companies, they're all very, very close to SW1. They are in this Westminster village. You will find most NGOs in the cheap seats, either in South London or up north, in kind of, definitely in North London. There is a disparity in kind of resources, and it's not that money buys you influence, it's just it really does help a lot. It buys you, for example, a certain amount of access, and it means that you can buy somebody, for example, you can hire somebody who has just walked out of number 10 with all the contacts and knowledge of how government works. Now, not many NGOs could do that, but large corporations and certainly consultancies can. But getting access is one way they do it. There is obviously the manipulation of the press, and they have a lot of former journalists working for particularly the agencies and in-house, and again, they know how the media works. They've got former colleagues there. They can spin the press. They can keep stories out of the press and get their lines across. They have the sort of darker side of the lobbying industry, where they will run campaigns attacking their opponents and the like. So there's an awful kind of range of ways that they do it, and it means that, how much time have I got?
Keep going for a few.
Okay.
We've lost one speaker, so you've gained a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, so it means that you get, I was going to just cover, because there are lots and lots of good things outcomes that can come from it, but there's also a hell of a lot of bad things and a lot of stuff that we don't see. So it will be lobbying by the oil and gas industry, for example, to change the tax regime in the UK, which meant that we, for a very long time, had one of the most generous tax regimes in the world for large offshore oil and gas projects, which meant that at some point we were actually paying companies like Shell, even though they were making huge profits, they were getting more in tax back from the Treasury than they were actually putting in, so which is ludicrous. Private healthcare companies lobbying for privatisation of bits of the NHS, pharmaceutical companies lobbying for our data, access to our data potentially, things like that. And London has this particular kind of dark side, which is we reputation wash for a lot of kind of quite unsavoury regimes. It's a bit of a laundrette, and that's partly because there is because of the lack of transparency in it. So that gives you kind of the book in about 3 minutes. There you go. Just to sum up then, so I used to get asked, well, there's good lobbying and bad lobbying, and there's not. There's open lobbying and there's secretive lobbying, and that's the distinction. Because if you're a car manufacturer, or a hotel, I'm not going to use your example, but if you're a car manufacturer, you support a lot of jobs in this country, and that's really great. So you want to keep making cars or whatever. But if you've got a kid with asthma, or all the other harms that come from cars or whatever, there's a public interest that is countered by the private interests of certain corporations or industries. And one useful way of looking at it is an investment. So companies will invest in lobbying because it delivers a return. So if you are, and it's going to be a really crude example here, but if, for example, you are a private hospital company and you want to get more business out of the NHS, you're going to lobby to get the government to open up the hospital system so more, elective stuff goes your way. So you spent a bit of money to lobby the government, but the return on that, in terms of the contracts that you get and the money you will get out of the, £120 billion NHS budget, is vast. So it's an investment that delivers a return. But it is dominated by private interest, and this is where the problem becomes around transparency, because whilst companies will, they'll be open with government about what they're doing, but they will not be open with the rest of us. And it's the lack of public debate about issues that are being decided between business and government without public input that is the concern. So just to sum up, if we had transparency in lobbying, and this is the example I always used to say, if we had transparency in lobbying, we would be able to see, for example, how much private healthcare companies are investing in lobbying, how much they're spending, because they'd have to declare it quarterly on a register, who they're meeting in government, they'd have to declare that, what they're lobbying for, so we'll be able to see that. You can see all this in the States, by the way. I'm not saying they've got a good political system, but they do have a fairly decent register. And you can see, you have a degree of transparency about what they're doing. Then you can make a call and you can say, well, if there's millions of pounds being spent by private healthcare on lobbying for the NHS, then why aren't we having a public debate about the privatisation of the NHS? There is a mismatch between what's happening privately and what we're being told and what we're allowed to debate publicly. So, yeah, there you go.
Sounds very good. Okay, I just want to remind everyone before they ask questions and before we open up the wider discussion, it is recorded, so whatever you say, you have to be prepared to know it will exist forever somewhere on a university website, which probably no one will look at. But okay, perhaps before I open it up to the wider room, perhaps we could have a little discussion. I don't want the ding-dong that you had on radio, but maybe Charles or Yasmin, you'd like to respond to some of the comments. I mean, one question I'd like perhaps ask Yasmin, having been in government in different ministries, is how representative is the consultation process? Is there really this strong bias towards firms or to the consultancies? And if that does exist, and in some policy domains I can imagine there is a narrow group of actors, how does the government try and overcome that bias in the consultation process? So maybe Jasmine on that, and then Charles, maybe if you want to respond as well to some of the comments.
Some of the stuff that Tamsin's outlined there, I don't recognise. I don't recognise some of the stuff around this amount of money being spent to do X amounts. I think if you step back within when I was in government, you spoke to a whole range of people. You know, very, very rarely was I speaking to what you'd call lobbying companies. You know, you'd have round tables, you'd get the chief execs in, you'd get the unions in, you'd get those people who run immigration, whatever it might be on the policy, and you'd have those discussions. Sometimes they'd be in smaller groups. So when I worked in Whitehall, it was really stringent. So everybody was really trained in not being swayed by one thing or the other. As Charles was saying earlier, and as Tam said, there will always be some bad actors. There will be. Every industry has their bad actors. But I don't think the whole industry is tarnished with that same brush. And I can only speak from personal experience. I don't think I can't just be lobbied from one particular viewpoint, because you have to be able to do policy from multiple viewpoints, and then you've got to do a policy impact assessment to say, if you implement this policy, what is the impact of it going to be? And if it's that jaundiced towards one particular viewpoint, it does get kind of flushed out. So I think, for me, more transparency, I am all for it. I work... I've got a huge team in America, so they're not all lobbyists, by the way. They've got a corporate affairs team, and there is much more transparency in the US. I mean, what they do with that is actually quite interesting. I'm not sure how much of that is then taken and saying, to Tamsin's point, you know, we're going to see what they spend, and if they're lobbying this much with this industry, we should have a public debate. I don't actually see that happening in the US. So I'm all for more transparency, but some of the picture you painted, if only, now that I'm on the other side, if only I could get that kind of access to Whitehall and within a flick of a switch be able to make them change their policies to everything I want to do. But that's why I ended my section saying, you don't always win your argument, and someone else might have a stronger argument, or when government policy comes out in the wash, what you wanted or what you wanted for your industry, you just got to sometimes take with a pinch of salt, saying somebody else won out.
His reputation is key, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you damage it.
So can I come back to 3 points? And unfortunately, a lot of the facts don't really support Tamsin's thesis, which I'll pick up on a couple of them, actually. Can I just talk your question about consultation? First thing, if you take London, the Mayor of London over the last 5-6 years has been consulting regularly about LTNs and around low emission zones in London, and on every occasion the consultation has come out strongly against, he's completely ignored it. So that's an example of how campaigners, such as yourself, have been very successful in persuading a politician to go down a path of action regardless of what the consultation is actually saying. It works the other way as well, but that's one example. The other myth I really to stamp on, because it is a ridiculous one, and that's the role of the private sector in the National Health Service, because in fact, you may well know, but I work for 2 private healthcare businesses back in 1999 and 2000, when John Reed, I don't know if it was long political memories, remember he was the man who actually began his life on the Scottish left, and realised that so many of the ideas of the left were completely disastrous and were letting down the working man and woman, that he actually became an ardent Blairite under the Labour administration. Their problem is that they'd inherited waiting lists that were too long from the previous Conservative government, and that bringing down waiting lists was one of Tony Blair's 5 pledges in the run-up to election. One of the answers they came up with, without any prompting, was the idea of using spare capacity in the private sector to treat patients for elective surgery. By elective surgery we mean kind of knees and hips. and it was always going to be time limited. The NHS would buy capacity, the NHS would be responsible for the standards, patients were sent to private hospitals, and then they kind of came back to their consultants in the National Health Service afterwards. It was quite a big financial intervention at the time, and I'm not saying that private healthcare companies did quite well out of it. One of the jobs of any consultant lobbyist working for a private healthcare company was making sure that if the government was going to design this scheme and invest in it, that it worked, that it was sensible, that it could deliver, that the risk to patients were minimal. I wouldn't be at all surprised over the next 3 years if West Streeting is turning to the private sector in order to increase capacity for elective surgery in the National Health Service. And this is not, repeat not, privatising the National Health Service. It's using facilities provided by the private sector to treat patients who've been waiting for a very long time. The private sector is all over the National Health Service. If you go to the GP and you get a blood test, where do you think that blood test goes to? To a nice National Health Service lab somewhere in North London? No, it goes to one of the best diagnostic companies in the world that's got a big contract with the NHS. They specialise in it. They turn these test results around in rapid time, and those results then go back to the patient far faster than they've ever done previously. Revealing what consultant lobbyists have been paid by these companies does absolutely nothing. It delivers nothing of any value other than allowing conspiracy theorists, like my friend on my right, to claim that the lobbyists, because they are being paid like £150,000 a year, that they've been able to influence government policy, when in fact it generally happens the other way around. The other thing I just want to say about regulation, okay? So the regulation of consultant lobbyists in Brussels and in the US and in the UK is evolving over the years. For 5 or 6 years, the UK in Europe actually had a far more transparent regime than they actually had in Brussels. The current position is that if a lobbyist on behalf of a company has an engagement with a government minister, with their private office, if they write a letter, all that has to be registered at something called the OCRL. Likewise, any ministerial engagement with consultancy lobbyists has to be noted at the departmental end as well, so that the two declarations can be married up. If you are a member of the Public Relations Consultancy Association, you have to declare, as I said earlier on, all your clients, and you have to name all your clients, and you also have to declare the name of every consultant who works for you or works in a public affairs capacity. And everyone talks a lot about the financial disclosures in the US. In a way, if consultant lobbyists such as myself were obliged to declare the fees we got from clients, they would pale in comparison to the sums of money that are spent on lobbyists in America. So there is an argument that actually it could be in the interests of the sector to make those types of financial declarations, because and also in Brussels as well. If you take a business like Google, which is not a client of mine, by the way, if you take a business like Google, they're spending vast amounts of money on lawyers and on consultants over Brussels to deal with the competition challenges from Vestager. I personally think that now we've got a new government, we've got a whole new host of consultant lobbyists out there, that there are a number of accidents waiting to happen, I think, with businesses out there that are not operating to the same ethical standards that most of the industry do operate. And when that happens, there may well be a need to tighten up. But the question, before we embrace regulation, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So Tamsin says the problem is that lobbyists have this amazing influence. So it's very important that we understand that everyone knows how much money we get paid and everyone knows what conversation we have at every stage of the week. but that implies that we have this mythical power when we don't. So we're actually not trying to solve a problem. Self-regulation does a very, very good job. And it's interesting that Rachel Reeves, in the last 3 months has actually begun to realise that more regulation is not necessarily the answer. So those are the 3 points I want to make.
Thank you. And one point you raised there that is important is actually what is declared as a lobbying expense. And I think even when there are transparency registers like in the US or in the EU, sometimes...
We have transparency registers over here, that is different.
No, absolutely, but in terms of the declaration, say, of a company and what they spent, there is huge discrepancy between what is perceived to be a lobbying activity and what is actually declared. So one company would say, it's my office, and it's the individuals working there, and I've paid for your consultancy. And another company will also say, well, I commissioned McKinsey to write a report for us on this, this particular catalytic converter or whatever it is, some scientific report by a university. So there is a broad spectrum of what could be perceived as lobbying and what is the information that facilitates.
The other thing that's happening big time in this country is lawyers are now engaged in the lobbying game.
Absolutely, which doesn't
count. And they hide behind client attorney privilege the whole time. You have absolutely no idea what they're doing or who they're working for. They sound terribly sorry. We cannot say who we're working for. We've now even got an Attorney General who says he couldn't possibly declare who he has worked for previously becoming Attorney General. So lawyers are competitively eating into our space as our members of the
That's really big in the US.
And it's huge in the
Huge
US. And it's quite big in
and
Brussels.
big in Brussels, big tech in Brussels, as you said, has been hiding behind the lawyers.
Yeah, we were told. I was told by a lobbyist, if you try and take on the lobbyists, take on the lawyers, you are going to lose. We lost anyway, but we were definitely going to lose against them. Can I come back on a couple
Absolutely,
of
and then I'll open.
Which order to do these in? I'm going to talk about things we're talking about, transparency and lobbying. As somebody who was on the kind of receiving end of the lobbying campaign against transparency and lobbying, and it was a campaign that you ran, and the industry has not embraced transparency. The industry largely fought against transparency when there was a real threat of regulation, or a real opportunity of opening up lobbying. They mounted campaigns to stop it. And what has happened over this has been going on for decades, but normally what happens is there is a spate of scandals around lobbying, and then there's a call for a demand that there is, the industry sort itself out, and then there's demands for more transparency. And what the industry has done, they've created a new body. So we had what do they call the APP?
Well, the APP, the history, the Association of Particle and Political Scholars, the APPC,
Yeah, that's it, APPC
was set up in the 90s.
After a spate of scandals. And then the APP says, no, we'll do transparency. No, we're going to clean it up. We're going to do it. We're going to have a register, and it's all going to be fine.
I'll give you all the website link afterwards, so you can go and see. It does exist.
Oh.
The PRCA exists, which has taken over the APPC. I will send you the website link, and you can see all the clients that we work for in the consultancy.
Can you guarantee? So what we have is a series of voluntary measures, things by the industry to stave off regulation. That's what they're doing. They are staving off the regulation. So the PRCA does have a register, and it does have people declare their clients on it. Can you guarantee to me, because I know plenty of lobbyists have told me otherwise, that every single client goes on that voluntary register? So if you've got an awkward client, or one that maybe there's a conflict of interest with another client, you don't want to put it on. There's nothing compelling you to do it. There's no sanction if you don't put it on there. And so if you don't have sanctions, how do you get compliance? So it is.
Well, there is a sanction if you don't put a client on it, and you're then found out to be advising that client.
Get chucked out of the PRCA.
Yeah, there's a board and there's a disciplinary process.
But other people won't work with you if you're not
I
on
know.
Yeah, correct.
I know, but it's not. It's a long way from regulation. So yeah, the industry has fought transparency, and yeah, they're going to tell you they are pro-transparency, but if you and there's a bit in my book.
I am pro-transparency because it's in our interest to be transparent.
There's a quote in the book which is from a lobbyist, which is the best lobbying is that which goes unnoticed, and which is why it's called a quiet word. It is that which happens behind closed doors where you don't have any public debate, there's nothing noisy, and you can come to an agreement. Now, you may not recognise this, and but and this is one of the points I wanted to make, I contend it's not a series of bad actors. This is a systemic thing that has been happening for decades. When you're talking about the NHS, there's lots I want to come back on, but I'm going to try and wrap it all up. There is nothing...
We have to open up to the room now.
There's nothing mythical about what you do. There are a series of very concrete steps and techniques and tactics and ways that you work that give you a systemic advantage. And it means that within the NHS, they're not getting pressured by lobbyists all the time. They're people who, like McKinsey or whatever, who they all end up thinking the same. This is not that, and so there is a difference between, I'm not going to have an ideological conversation with you about whether it's right or wrong privatisation of the NHS or not, but there is a systemic advantage that certain actors have within our NHS that means that it is heading in a certain direction.
Okay. I'm going to stop there for a moment and take questions from the room. We might come back on that point about how you maybe compensate for the lack of resources and lack of numbers if you are sort of an NGO trying to put a counter voice to this from a strategy perspective. But I'll save that question and see what we get from the room. Okay, can I ask, when you give your question, can you say who you are? If you're from an organisation, or if you're a student here, please tell us you're a student here. And thanks. Okay, and I'll collect 3 questions, and then we'll let people choose if they wish to answer it or not, so no one's under pressure. Okay. Thanks.
I have 2 brief questions, if that's okay.
All right, if they're brief.
Okay, my name is Dylan. I'm a master's student here at UCL doing philosophy of science with focus on the ethics of artificial intelligence. I also did law at Cambridge. My first question is for you, Yasmin. How do you lobby for tourism-friendly policies during times of environmental crises and emergencies that require investigations and a halt to day-to-day operations? And then the question for the whole panel is, how do you see the role of lobbying evolving with the rise of digital advocacy and social media campaigns?
Okay, I'll collect a few more questions. Also, one thing we haven't talked about is different venues, because you talked about green and tourism. There are different ministries where you have different favourable individuals, should we say. Okay, yes?
Hello, my name is Mirza. I'm specialized in digital advocacy, campaign strategy, execution, and implementation evaluation. As I have experience coming from the background of marketing and digital advocacy, so I'm particularly concerned with how AI, there is AI boom nowadays. So how AI is transforming strategic communication and how you people are dealing with this.
Okay. Another question. We'll take one here.
Thanks so much. I'm not a student here. I work for a large multinational, but I'm here in a personal capacity. Two questions. One to everybody about what does good look like, because I think we can see, referring to America, that's not working either. So I don't understand referring to America as like an example of good. So is there a good? And the second one is, sorry, gentlemen, I said,
sure.
Thank you. So following the money, I don't understand the argument. If presumably corporate clients aren't spending huge amounts of money to get no results, so they're clearly paying large amounts of money for results. So either you're saying we don't deliver results, but they're paying us large amounts of money for no reason, or what exactly is it that you're delivering?
Okay. So the way I understood it, there's a question of balancing hospitality and green. Yes. Then there's 2 questions to everybody: AI and what does good look like, and then there's the following the money question to Charles. So perhaps we'll start at the end. Do you want to start with the green hospitality question?
On that, when I say we talk to governments around tourism and what it can do for societies, I've also got responsibility for the corporate affairs, the CR and sustainability agenda. And as an industry, I know particularly for my own organisation, we are doing a heck of a lot with our third-party hotels around what can we do on our decarbonisation journey? How do we make some of the hotels making more energy efficient? We do a lot of things around waste. And we do a lot of things around water. And because we're a global company, you know, we deal with a lot of disasters across the world, and hotels are always there at the time. We are physically in communities where disasters strike. So in those circumstances, we work with those emergency services. We open our hotels up for either, you know, the fire service or the first responders when they have to be there. But we also open it up to, we give certain, to our colleagues who are often living in those areas where the disaster has struck, we give them assistance and advice, because often their homes have been damaged, etc. So that's just what we do as a business, because hotels are always there. So in the recent fires in the US, in LA, we did all of those things, including, you know, for our guests, you know, complete no cancellation fees, etc., etc. That's just good things you should do. The other piece is around, you do have a lot of conversation in certain parts of the world around, you know, these cruise ships shouldn't be coming here anymore, it's causing too much pollution. And I think those are really good conversations to have. And I think what we're trying to do is to also educate all of us as consumers, is don't just go onto Google and go, what's the 10 most loveliest places in Italy to go to? They're going to send you to the same places where we're all going to go. It's actually widening our horizons, because there are so many other places to go to. So I think we're really responsible. You know, we've got our climate targets, we've got our science-based targets. We're trying to make the hotels as efficient as possible. We do things around waste and water, and we also work with the laws and the regulations in the countries where we operate in. Some countries, it's so much easier to do recycling. In other companies, it isn't. And more importantly, we think it's really simple. Please have glass bottles, not plastic bottles. In certain parts of the world, the guests won't trust a bottle unless it's got a plastic cap on that hasn't been tampered with, because they don't think it's going to be safe. So there's a whole range of things that we do, but working through, I mean, just in the last year we've done 27 disasters across the world, in China, the US, you name it, whether it be hurricanes, fires, eruptions, etc. So we kind of have to, and it's just part of what you do, because you are physically in those communities where these things are happening around you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. On sustainable tourism, we have a cruise company as a client, and these businesses are actively changing their business models in response to campaigns of all sorts of different kinds, from environmentalists, but actually mostly from residents in towns or in cities where the cruise ships come in. So they are now one of the complaints often from a city is these tourists come in for 1 hour or 2 hours, they spend their money, they cause chaos, and then they leave again. How can they change the visit regime? How can they actually change the sort of all-in-one nature of the package? A lot of cruise ships are actually closing down the ship for 3 or 4 hours when tourists leave the ship to go into a town, so they actively spend in the town before they go back onto the ship. And they're doing it naturally because it's good for business, and also they're very conscious of their license to operate, or what you might call their license to visit. But, you had a question about digital advocacy. Yeah. So obviously that is a very big part of what's happened in the kind of lobbying industry for the last 5-6 years, particularly. Digital advocacy tools are used on both sides. So you saw very, very good examples of digital advocacy campaigns around sewage in rivers. That's probably one of the best examples, I think, over the last 3 years. There'll be various campaigns that have surfaced against sewage and river action, and you look at their content output, and it's very powerful, and it's caused politicians to think, and regulators to think long and hard about the way in which water companies are regulated and fined for breaching their license conditions. On the other side of the equation, you will see a number of very effective digital campaigns spring up as a result of Rachel Reeves' first budget. Farmers is a very good example. There's a huge amount of anger in the countryside about various measures in the budget. They're using social media extremely effectively. In fact, the first demonstration in London, when they all kind of arrived with their tractors, do you remember? That was actually organised by one sort of influencer in the farming community in Wales, and it sprang from there. So it's happening in all sorts of different ways. But just before Tamsin accuses the lobbying industry of pumping huge amounts of money into these sinister content campaigns, in my experience, most of them happen organically, you know, it's sort of part of the process. In terms of AI transforming most of your question, in terms of
strategic communication and keeping the transparency.
and keeping transparency around the use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Yes. So if I can answer that from the consultancy perspective,
Yeah, I can do it.
maybe you can answer from the in-house. There are a whole range of AI tools. There are new ones that appear on the market every week. There's huge amounts of testing going on. The cost of the use of AI tools is tumbling big time, as we've seen in the last week. What is absolutely essential is that if you're using artificial intelligence as a consultant to execute any task for a client, you have to declare it to the client. The client demands it. It's beginning to be written into contracts as well, and it's good practice for the consultancy as well to seek the permission of the client to use artificial intelligence, ahead of doing it on their behalf. In my experience, AI works quite well for some things, and for other things, it's completely useless. So you might say, draft a press release. Huh?
No.
No?
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work. However, draft 800 words on the subject of participatory democracy or crony capitalism, and you'll get quite an interesting first draft, which you can then sort of work on and develop it. And one of the things that we do in the consultancy business is the client says, can you get me an article in the Times or something like that? So first thing you've got to do is write it. So I would say it's still quite early days in terms of the idea of it sort of completely taking over the industry.
Yeah, I would just build on that. I think it is early days, and I think in corporate affairs, in strategic communications, the quality and the accuracy of what you're putting out there is essential. That is your reputation. If you're putting something out there that's got the wrong figures in, or it looks like it's been manipulated, so you do need that human. You do need that human element. But we do use it, but you've got to be transparent about it. So we use it on some of our call centres where we have people speaking thousands and thousands of different languages. So we do have call centre colleagues, but they can supplement. So we've got some AI, and when the guest speaks, that gets translated, and then they translate it back to what the caller is saying back to the guest. But that's all very transparent. So it's actually really useful. We have got a number of pilots happening in the organisation, done by our global technology team, just to look at how we use AI, where it's appropriate, where it's not. It's not the answer to everything. But it has its uses. But you just have to be careful, particularly from a strategic communications perspective, that what you are putting out there is real. And we, for example, don't use things like, AI-generated images, for example. We're a hotel company, we use images of real people. But there's a whole range of things within that as well.
Just as you can't write your essays with AI either. Tamsin, do you want to come in on digital or AI or any of the other questions?
Yeah, on the digital thing, it's not a lot. I don't know a lot about it. I tend to work on the press side of things, and I'm 52 and I can't be asked to learn. So I'm really sorry. It's obvious. I mean, with the Rosebank campaign against this oil field, there is a large and very active online community in the Stop Rosebank network, and they're very good. And that's one of our campaigning tools. I think maybe, so I mean, that is something that we do. I was just going to talk about, and this is a tidbit I got off a guy from Edelman, 10, 15 years ago, so I don't know if this is the case now. But to the digital side of things, there was a time when it was kind of it was quite exciting because of how it upended kind of power relations, because if you imagine that if you are, so the press side of things and manipulating the press is a really big part of the lobbying industry, because you need basically to have a kind of an enabling information environment that allows the minister to be able to make the decision that you want them to make. So, you know, there's big lobbying campaigns, for example, a while ago against the top rate of tax. So what they get is they'll get, I don't know, a dozen economists to write to the Telegraph and open letters saying this is why we need to scrap the top rate of tax and all those kinds of big kind of press operations that lay the ground that allow the government to then do the thing that you want them to do. And how that happens is often the case, you know, so there's people who've worked in newspapers working in lobbying, and they'll phone up the person they know on that paper or whatever, and that's how you place stories. And it's, you know, lots of people work in PR, are former journalists. It doesn't preclude anybody who hasn't got that access from doing it, but it's just easier if you used to work for the guy who's now the editor of The Sun. Do you know what I mean? It just makes it easier. So, and that used to be the case. And I remember this guy from Edelman years ago, I was sat at the back of a talk that he was giving, and he was saying, and digital has kind of upended all that, because there's this huge online space that they can't control anymore. It's not controlled by a handful of people, relatively speaking, who have these relationships and can control a whole public narrative. That isn't how the world works anymore, we're far from it. So there's this huge digital space, and he talked about how, and this is a large consultancy like Charles, is how they had these huge social media monitoring kind of systems where they would basically be looking out for, and his words, anybody who badmouthed their client, or I don't know if it's exactly his words, but the gist was, anybody who badmouthed their client in whatever 120 characters or whatever, they're going to pick it up, and then they decide, is this person influential, or are they just echoing something that somebody else has said? So then it was their job to find the influential person and then run a campaign against them. And they can, you know, there's all sorts of tactics for kind of quietening people down. And he was kind of an old sort of Foreign Office type, and he was talking like it was the Cold War. They had these listening posts out there, listening for the influential people, and it was all quite paranoid and stuff. So that was one thing they did. There's a lot of social media monitoring. There was the classic cases of kind of manipulating Wikipedia. That was another thing they used to do. Pumping out press releases so that, I don't know how this works, basically so your content gets to the top of the Google search. So search engine optimization or whatever you call that, I can't remember what it is. But, you know, that kind of thing. There's all sorts of digital tools that they have to manipulate that exist to manipulate the digital sphere, which is, yeah, so there's stuff in the book about that. But you're starting to sort of see, and it's just tools and tactics, it's not mythical, it's just tools and tactics for making sure that the story that, whether it's BP after an oil spill or whoever it is, the story they want to tell gets out, and the story that's being told against them is buried, basically.
Okay. If we're quick, 2 short questions. They have to be short questions, and then I'll get short answers.
There's a lady who asked
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
two questions over there.
There was a
We'll come back on.
We'll come back.
The good.
What does good look like?
What is good? Can all of you can end on what you think good is. Okay. So I'll take Alan, and then.
Thank you. Alan Rennick from UCL. I simply wanted to re-ask the 2 other questions that were asked in the row in front of me, because they seem to be incredibly important questions. So particularly to Tamsin, does transparency really work? It doesn't seem to work in the United States. And to Charles and Yasmin, your argument seems to be that more money doesn't give you better and more lobbying. And that's an absurd argument, surely. I mean, of course more money gives you more and better lobbying. And to respond by saying that, well, lobbyists don't always win, well, no one ever thought that lobbyists always win. The point is that it skews the discourse in the direction of the moneyed interests. So just, you know, providing a few examples where the lobbyists have not won does not respond to Tamsin's point, and does not respond to the point here. So I'd like to know.
So can I answer that point?
I won't let you. I will. I just want to collect one other question here.
Yeah, because you mentioned roundtables in lobbying, which I think not enough people know what a lobbying session looks like. When you sit at a round table, just very briefly, can you describe how many sector interests are there, how many citizen representatives are there, how many NGOs, and what are the balances? Because I think, yes, it's participatory democracy, and I think from those who study democracy, we know it's great. Is there equal participation for everyone in your experience? And does the way of a company, a multinational company, does their view sometimes count more or less than, for example, a small business or citizens that are concerned that their city is over tourism and like Airbnb stuff? So can you speak to that in your experience, maybe?
That's why you need the transparency, to see the accountability, who's at the table, the room where it happens.
Yeah, but you're holding only businesses accountable, right? Like you
Well,
don't.
no, you want to see all groups.
Yeah.
Okay, who would like to go first? Charles, you wanted to say something. And then-
Well, I think that's a really good question,
Yeah.
actually, because there is an answer to that, and that is that the participation, the actors around a table, or a round table, and the balance of business and third sector and NGOs, it tends to change depending on who the government is. So under a Labour government, there will be more seats around the table for, say, DEFRA, for you worked in DEFRA under a Labour government, didn't you? For environmental campaigners or for scientists who might have a particular point of view, and less seats for business. And the reverse is the case when there tends to be a Conservative government.
Yeah, and the thing I would add to that is it depends on the subject matter. So you around a round table, you may not have a tick box of every single group that you need around that table, but you've got to do it to make sure that all of those groups are involved. And I do agree to Charles's point, depending on what government you have in power, depends on who you get around the table. I mean, one of the things I do have to say is the most impressive lobbyists that I have ever come across in my life are the environmental lobbyists. And I don't mean BPs and Shells of this world. I mean the people who, what we've managed to get into regulation and legislation across the world, in the EU, the UK, the US, what companies have got to report on their things like TCFD, climate-related financial implications of what you're doing. I think they're amazing. I wouldn't say they've got huge amounts of money. They've clearly got some backing. And I do believe that just money doesn't buy it. You've also got to have a rational argument as well. You've got to have something that adds to that policy or helps negate a negative of a policy. But I think the environmental lobby and some of the social lobbies have been some of the most successful in the world.
I agree with that. And there have been some very, very expensively furnished lobbying campaigns that have completely failed. They've got absolutely nowhere. But I agree, environmental campaigners have been very, very successful, and certainly their ability to redirect government energy policy has been very successful in relation to what we're now seeing from the Labour government in the run-up to it. In terms of what, I'll answer the money question in a minute. In terms of what good looks like, we should always be careful about kind of coming up with hard and fast statements about the way our society is run, because something will trip us up. But compared with a lot of European countries and other countries in the world where I operate as a business, this is relatively free of corrupt behaviour. Relatively free of corrupt behaviour. What happens is every so often there is an example of corrupt behaviour, and quite rightly there's a hue and cry, and it's exposed by the media, and the individual involved is pilloried. But in terms of the sums of money involved compared with some of the scandals in Belgium, in Italy, in France, it's pretty small beer. And we are as a society, we like to think that sinister behaviour is going on the whole time, and that people are handing over sacks of cash in order to influence policy. And it's just not the case. Take the example of Dale Vince, which I think is a really interesting case, where he gave, $5 million to the Labour Party? £5 million to the Labour Party. He's now horrified at the direction of...
Heathrow.
he's horrified by Heathrow, and he's horrified by the direction of government policy on solar farms, is it? Or I
Yeah.
think, which he just disagrees with. So he spent all this money, and policy's heading off in another direction, which I think is entirely healthy, because it happens on the other side as well. I know someone who gave a large amount of money to the Conservative Party, hoping that something would happen, and they didn't. They absolutely didn't get it, having invested a lot of money into it. So what good looks like? I don't think we need to go much further to identify what good looks like. We have a very, very healthy media in this country. There's a very, very good tradition of investigative journalism in this country. Sometimes I hear about things that are on the dodgy side, and I immediately say to myself, that will be out in a few months, and it generally does. It generally does come out. In terms of the argument about would we be better informed if all big companies had to declare how much they spent on lobbying, the answer would be for a year everyone would be hugely interested, and then every year great big declarations were made, would be made, and it does not inform the public debate in any way. As this happens in America, I've got lobbyists, friends of mine in Washington, who've been declaring the amounts of money, I think over 100,000 a year, that they get from big corporations for 10 or so years. And they said it was of huge interest when it was announced. And now when they make the declaration of it, no one reports on it. There are specific requirements run by the DOJ in America, which means that if you are taking money from a foreign government, you have to declare it. Otherwise, you could be subject to a criminal action by the DOJ. There's a sort of prurience, in my view, about somehow relating the money to the outcome in order to reinforce Tamsin's arguments. This is a huge conspiracy, and the lobbyists are all powerful, and we have the ability to change policy on the turn of a pin. So that was my answer.
I've been called a conspiracy theorist in Parliament, so it's like water off a duck's back, mate. We're not talking about brown paper envelopes full of cash. That isn't how it works. It's not corrupt.
We're in Belgium. That's true.
In this room, it's about the corrupting nature of this industry, this commercial industry, influence industry is what we're talking about, which is corrupting our democracy and has led to declining levels of trust in our government. Why isn't the government doing what we want it to do? Some of the answer to that is because there is a very, very powerful business lobby that doesn't want it to happen. Or why are things happening that we disagree with, that clearly polling shows that the public doesn't want, like scrapping the top level of tax or whatever.
Is that why Rachel Reeves hasn't changed it?
I'm talking about like 10 years ago. I can't remember when I looked at the campaign, but it was a nice organised campaign by a bunch of people who wanted to get rid of the top rates of tax, but 75% of the public thought it was really good, but then the government got rid of it anyway because there was this big campaign. Anyway, it's corrupting is what I'm saying. To the point about round tables, that's a really good question, because it's this is a really good example of kind of the how there is this disparity in power. So when I was lobbying against the lobbying industry, I remember I was invited to a meeting with the minister, and we were like, yes, great, we've got a meeting with the minister, this is really exciting. And as we were walking in to the meeting, there were all these people walking out of a meeting with the minister. They'd had the round table, right? And then me and a colleague were like at the fag end of this meeting. They were all lobbyists talking about lobbying, transparency, sorting out what it was going to look like. And then we got a meeting after with the minister, and I tell you, it was like talking to a bin. We might as well have been talking to a bin. He was just shut down. And he ticked, he can put on his register that he'd met us, but there was the level of engagement and the level of discussion there was no parity there. So that's the kind of sort of system-wide kind of problems we're talking about. Just also on roundtables, it's not just the ones that the government invites people into, it's also the ones that are created around government. So there is a big kind of industry of think tanks, which act like commercial lobbying agencies, where they create roundtables and they will invite the minister in, and it'll be sponsored by the corporate that's giving the money to the think tank. And it's all about filling the information environment around around that minister with the messages you want them to hear. So we'll conduct this round table, and there'll be people from whatever ministry or the minister, whoever it is there, and then the corporate will be there sat next to the minister, and there'll be a couple of other people, maybe a few journalists or whatever. And this is standard practice in the commercial lobbying industry, and they'll create this round table, but they get to choose who's there, and they'll get to frame the conversation in a way that is helpful to them. So maybe they want to talk about, I mean, framing of conversations is a whole other thing, but you know, that's another thing that they do. So it's, yeah, there's
That happens on left and right as well, you know that.
I am not saying it's not ideological. I'm just saying this happens, you know, and who your good is my bad, but my vice versa. It's just not open, and there is very little public debate about it. So I've never argued good against bad. It's not about that. I'm not good, you're not bad, whatever. It's just about open or not, and having public debates about it or not. And to your final point about the healthy state of investigative journalists, you know the economics of newspapers, you know that they are hemorrhaging cash. It is not in a healthy, you know, this is a cliche that's kind of rolled out. You know, we've got the British press will hold them to account. Bullshit, it will.
Okay, on that note, I think we've come to the end of time. I just want to announce before I thank our speakers, next week's talk is on is development possible without fossil fuels? So obviously another area of lobbying. So please come again if you wish. Hopefully we'll see all of you.
Yes is the answer to that.
And I'd like to thank our three speakers. I learnt a lot. It's fascinating to hear about all the coalitions and strategies and venues you go to. So thank you ever so much. And it was good. You had a good debate, but you didn't fall out this time. So that's good.